Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name's James Copley, and I'm joined by my colleague Phil Smith today. Phil, how are you doing?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, two disappointing defeats. It's been a little bit of a false start, hasn't it? But yeah, all right.
Well, we'll start right there, Phil, with the two defeats. There was the loss to Ipswich Town in the Championship last Sunday. Sunderland followed that up with a result against Crewe Alexander, drawing the game but losing on penalties on Tuesday in the Carabao Cup first round. A lot of concern, Phil, from Sunderland fans on social media. It has been a disappointing start. Where do you stand on that disappointing start? Is it something that Sunderland fans should be overly concerned about at the moment, or is it simply just a bit too early to tell?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I think. I mean, I think the Carabao Cup stuff particularly, you've got to be really, really careful with because I think, it's Carabao Cup first round games are always terrible because it's a specific set of circumstances where it's really close to the first league game of the season, and so teams invariably make 11 changes. 10, 11 changes. But it's even worse than the FA Cup third round where something similar happens because what you have in this game is you have loads of academy players playing who maybe haven't trained that much with the first team on a regular basis. And you've also got loads of summer signings coming into the team, often for the first time, who aren't at full match fitness and also haven't trained with many of their teammates. And they possibly don't even really know some of the academy lads that they're playing with. And that's why you see up and down the land, loads of teams get knocked out in the first round of the Carabao Cup. It happens. We saw the other side of it when Sunderland were in League One and they knocked out Blackpool, who were in the Championship when Sunderland were in League One. We knocked out Burnley and Sheffield United, didn't we, one year when they were Premier League teams? So it's just something that happens. Whether it's definitely concern is that Sunderland's sort of 11 of players who are there to step in if there's an injury or come off the bench. The two performances against Hartlepool and Crewe have both been really, really, really poor. And I think while we shouldn't get overly concerned about a Carabao Cup defeat, there is definitely a concern, I think, that some of these players who are an injury away from coming into the starting 11 for a championship game against potentially really tough opposition have not played well at all in two games against pretty, League Two and National League opposition. So I think if you could tell me now that there would be another good striker coming in before the end of the window, and maybe another attacking player, then I'd say let's not be too concerned. At some point, this team's going to click. Large parts of the Ipswich performance are really strong. There's loads of exciting things happening. But there is a concern because at the moment there is that lack of sort of quality and depth in a couple of key positions.
Yeah, lack of quality and depth, and the situation, Phil, surrounding Danny Barth. There's been a little bit of talk of Alex Pritchard, Lyndon Gooch, who are all entering the last year of their contracts. What was Tony Mowbray saying about those situations? Obviously, all individual situations, but he had a pretty clear message, really, didn't he, post Crewe, in terms of the club not wanting to stand in players' way?
Yeah, it's something we've talked about loads on this podcast. We've talked about it with Bailey Wright. We've talked about it with Tom Flanagan. We've talked about it with Carl Winchester, where probably you look at it and go, the ideal situation really is for these players to stay as injury cover, basically. But Sunderland's stance is incredibly strong. It's a huge part of their recruitment message when they bring players in, that they won't stand in your way when they feel the time is right to move on. That they put the player first. So if there's a longer, better contract, more game time elsewhere, they won't stand in players' way. So I think that it's therefore fairly obvious to draw the fact that when you've got three players in the last year of their contract, where there would be some uncertainty over their long-term future, that there would be discussions about them potentially moving on. My view, generally speaking, I get it. My view on this one is slightly different because at the moment, I just think those three players would leave an absolutely huge hole in the squad. From where I'm sitting, we're not talking about three players who, would potentially be useful if you get 3 or 4 injuries. Trey Hume got sent off on Saturday. Now, luckily, the rules mean he served his suspension the other night.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But technically, if that was to happen again, or he picks up injury, Lyndon Gooch is your right back. and a good one at that. And we saw the impact he made when he came off the bench. Alex Pritchard, for me, is still one of the best players in this squad. And we saw that when he came off the bench against Ipswich. He just settled someone down. He got them playing. He helped change the game, really. So, in short, it makes me nervous in this occasion.
Yeah, me too.
Now, what I would say as well is we shouldn't leap to conclusions that Sunderland are going to push all three out the door. I think there's an understanding that, maybe you could afford to lose one of them, but certainly not all three. And I think there is an understanding that the experience and also literally just the depth they give the squad would need to be replaced. So I think also fans should bear that in mind, because sometimes I don't think fans should be sitting here thinking they're just gonna let all three go and just crack on as if nothing happened. I really don't think that's the case. So we should bear that in mind as well. But yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic, because I do feel it's been unsettling as well, because they're three key players in your dressing room, and three important players in the team. And I do think it's been unsettling, and I wonder if there's maybe a little something to reflect on there, because I think it has helped. I don't think it's created, and I don't mean this in the dressing room. I've got no idea what goes on in the dressing room, very obviously. But I mean just amongst the general vibe of the club, I think it's been a little bit unsettling.
Do you think possibly, Phil, that the Mowbray situation and the summer feeds into that a little bit, and then there's the Stewart contract, the Roberts contract, the Clark contract?
Yeah, I think so. And some of that's just some of it is just the basic order that the transfer window should shut before the season starts. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. That in itself is unsettling, the transfer window being open.
Yeah, and the club can't do anything about the fact that Jack Clark's had a brilliant season, that Burnley wanted to sign him. Actually, you'd have to say that situation's been dealt with pretty well. We know for a fact that the player has never pushed for a move.
Yeah.
And that the club have been really clear in terms of there's a valuation. If the club hits it, we will let you go and talk to Burnley and make your mind up whether you want that move. But if they don't, you won't. And that hasn't happened. And actually, I think that aspect of it has been really good. There's maybe been some external noise beyond the club and the player that has not helped. But the point I'm making is some aspects of it the club can't control. And if you look at any other club in the division, I'm thinking of Southampton off the top of my head, because, Livramento, James Ward-Prowse, it's an absolutely farcical situation that the transfer window is still open when the season begins. It helps nobody. It's just stupid. That's the only word I can think of it. But what I would say is that this window, it has affected Sunderland because of the successful year they had last year. And they've had that difficult balance between trying to improve the squad and maintain what made it good last year. But I do agree with you. The season has started with more questions than anybody would have liked. Some of that, it's hard really to put much fault with the club for, because some of it is just football. And as I was going back to before, some of it just feels a little bit uncomfortable and odd, really. And I would put Pritchard in as a perfect example of that. Just an excellent footballer, and Gooch, an incredible servant to Sunderland. Just seems a bit odd that we're having these conversations. Do you know what I mean? Even if there is a reason for it. So, yeah, I definitely think it feels a little bit unsettled. That's the word I would use. And I think that's fed into the fact that when you then lose a couple of games, probably the reaction is stronger than it might sometimes be. But we have got to keep a bit of perspective, because Ipswich are going to be right up there this year.
I thought they were really good, Ipswich.
Their budget is huge, and I don't mean that in a particularly sort of dismissive way, because they've also recruited an excellent head coach and they've signed good players. So I'm not saying it's just all about money, but the point I'm making is they're a proper opponent, and someone could easily have beaten them. Probably should have got something out of the game. So we do have to really, while I totally get that this, like I say, that sense of being slightly unsettled, and the striker thing, very obviously I totally get it, because when you've come out of two windows being left a little short, and you're coming towards the end of a third window where you're still short, I totally get the anxiety. But we do have to balance it by saying, look, the club's in a better position in so many ways than it has been for many, 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 many years. And, Chris Rigg scoring, becoming the youngest goal scorer in AFL Cup history, we should we should bear that kind of stuff in mind as well. You know, these kind of things are happening for a reason because the club's in a good place. So
Yeah.
Definite get the vibe, definitely get that, respect that feeling of people feeling this more unsettled than it should be, and definitely get a little bit of concern in terms of the team at the moment is missing a couple of bits that it really needs.
We'll come to Chris Rigg in a second because it's an amazing story, and I would definitely like to talk about it and do it justice. But I think, Phil, on this podcast, we have a tendency to focus on the footballing matters because that's our job at the end of the day. But I think feeding into this uncertainty and into this noise around the club maybe has been off the field issues as well with the ticketing, the club shop and getting kits and stuff like that. And that all seems to be just coming together at the wrong time, unfortunately. And some supporters are understandably a bit miffed. And I think we have to take a sort of holistic view of the football club at the moment, don't we? And accept that on the field, it's been good for the past sort of year and a bit, albeit with a few bad results to start the season. But off the field, whilst there has been some advances, no doubt about that, and some appointments to key areas at the academy and all sort of that. But in terms of commercial, there does seem to be some angst from Sunderland fans at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, I mentioned this in the column that I wrote yesterday, that I do think that's part of the reason why 2 defeats has created the reaction that it has.
Which is understandable, I think, as well.
Yeah, because I think we have to, again, we have to take a really sort of broad view of it all. When the new ownership came in and took control, the club had been pretty gutted. It was a very stripped back operation. The initial focus was on investing heavily in the football side, because I think the view was, until you get Sunderland out of League One, you can kind of forget everything else because it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. So we saw the investment in players. We saw the investment, particularly at the Academy Elite, in terms of rebuilding the recruitment staff, the analytics staff, the academy itself. And then football is always there's always a delay. So you make decisions, and by and large, you don't see the results of them for 18 months. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing that delay, if you like, in terms of we're looking at it going, wow, there's a pretty impressive footballing structures being put in place, albeit it would be nice if they could sign another striker or two. But we're now seeing that where the club hasn't accelerated as much as anybody would have liked is from that off field, from what was inherited to where it should be for a club of this size. That's not me making excuses, because a club of this size should have everything it needs to service a huge fan base. But I think what we've seen is it doesn't at the moment.
Yeah.
I think some aspects of it, the retail stuff, I think our understanding is that it's primarily a supply issue. But, it isn't great when you announce a new long-term kit deal and then you have to announce changes to it a week later, and then it's difficult for fans to get kits. I think what it boils down to, we should also say as well that the digital ticketing, while it's caused understandably a huge amount of angst for a lot of fans over the summer, Sunday it seemed to operate really well. The club did the right thing, getting fans in early and offering that 50% off on the concourse. It seemed to work well. But I think the general picture, going back to what you allude to, is that I don't think, if you think of the key connection points, if you like, between fans and club, ticket office, retail, fans clearly don't feel that connection is anywhere near as strong as it should be. And that will mean that if you're winning games, you'll probably get away with it to an extent. And if you're not, it'll mean that the vibe's not very good. I know that there's definitely an acceptance behind the scenes at Sunderland that there needs to be more investment, and it needs to be addressed. I know they're hiring, it was reported, wasn't it, David Bruce from the MLS, the chief marketing officer at the MLS. From what I hear, his brief's going to be pretty wide-ranging in terms of some of these things that I talked about, commercial, retail. So you have to hope that will start to make a difference. So yeah, I again, that's something I totally get, and it is something that I think has fed into maybe this little bit of unease that we're feeling this week. The only thing I would say is that I can understand why, when the new ownership and the new hierarchy arrived at the club, their primary focus was on sorting out the football club, the football side of the business. Now we're reaching a point where, the rest of it has to catch up, and it has to catch up quickly.
Yeah, and it's something you will think will get sorted as well, Phil, because purely from a business standpoint, it's a massive revenue stream. The Sunderland's fan base is pretty big, and if everyone can buy a shirt and everyone's engaged, and it's easy for everybody, it's a big plus for the club. So you'd imagine that would hopefully get sorted soon. But yeah, I can understand Sunderland fans' frustration on some of the issues. Let's dive into the positives, because we haven't really touched on many of them. But Chris Rigg becoming Sunderland's youngest ever competitive goal scorer, brilliant story. Youngest goal scorer in EFL Cup history, beating the likes, I think it was Rudy Fabregas and Connor Wickham, which is a little bit of a Sunderland throwback there for you. But yeah, I mean, every time he's trusted, he seems to come up with something, a moment. I thought that during pre-season, with the exception of the Hartlepool game, which was a tough night for everybody. He looked good when he came on against Mallorca, and then he gets his first goal. And we've said it a million times on this podcast, but the sky is the limit, and he could play a very active role in Sunderland's sort of achievements this season, which is crazy to think given his age.
Yeah, it was really interesting speaking to Mowbray after the game, because he one of the things he talked about was, you mentioned that Hartlepool game, and this almost dilemma that Mowbray's got himself with Chris Rigg in terms of he's 16, so I have to be incredibly respectful of the fact that he's 16, but also I know he's good, and so I don't want to judge him too differently to the rest of the first team squad. So Mowbray was really open in saying, I thought I was really disappointed with how he played against Hartlepool, and I thought he was really poor by his standards, but also like he's 16, so how does that? And that's really interesting. I think Chris Rigg should take it as a massive compliment if Mowbray is criticising his performance as a 16-year-old, because that tells you how highly he holds him in that esteem. And one of the things Mowbray said about the other night was, what pleased me was that in the first half, I asked him to be quite disciplined, sort of to protect the back four, not worry too much about breaking forward. But then at half time, he was very strong in saying to Rigg, listen, Crewe, they've scored from a set piece, but they aren't offering much going forward, and especially not now that they've taken the lead. So the onus is on you is to get forward. I don't want to see you sitting in front of the back four anymore. Get forward, get into the box, start bouncing off Pritchard, start bouncing off Dak. And lo and behold, he gets on the edge of the box and scores with his wrong foot. And that was something that, Mowbray referenced as, it gives me a lot of hope as a coach that when, the players are listening to me, they're taking it on board, they're following my instructions. And that's really important for Rigg, because it gives him a chance of getting on the pitch in league games if Mowbray thinks he can trust him to do the role he's been asked to do. So, like I say, it's really interesting sort of trying to judge a player like this, who is just is a freakish talent for his age. And so it's hard to judge, because you do judge them differently just to you would a normal 16-year-old, but then I'm sure the player himself does, because the player's got massive ambitions for what they want to do in their career. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating over the course of the season, really, to watch this develop. And Rigg said after the game, didn't he, in an interview with the club, that he wants to try and get some minutes this year, and then really hope to put himself in a position to try and start quite regularly next year. And that seems about right. When you consider that Bellingham's 17 and he's probably a year on, I think, from Rigg. Bellingham made 3 or 4 starts for Birmingham last year. And then obviously we'll be hoping to probably play, say, 30 games this year. So that seems to make sense. Tells you that he's got a sensible head on his shoulders, ambitious, but understands where he's at. It's exciting. Really, really, really exciting. And going back to what we said before, 3 years ago, Chris Rigg would already have gone. He would not be at Sunderland, for lots of reasons. And the fact that he's made a decision that, players like Joe Hugill, Sam Greenwood, I could go on and on, couldn't I? Felt like they couldn't make a few years ago. Now a young player thinks they can make it, and we shouldn't gloss over that too much just because we've had a couple of disappointing defeats.
Yeah, it's a scary thought that he's only just 16 as well. I think he turned 16. I think he's like 16 years and 1 month old. It's silly. It really is silly. But what a talent. Transfers, Phil. We've got about 3 weeks left of the transfer market. being
Do we
open
have to?
for business. I know. We've got to do it. We've got to milk it for all it's worth. But you know, that attitude you've just shown there is I think widely the same as the fan base as well, in the sense that we know what we need. We need a striker. We need some experience. That, I guess the question is, are we going to get it? We know the club will try to get it, and we know the club are aware of these issues. Mowbray has talked about them at length over several windows now. But as ever, there's a lot of factors at play. Sunderland don't want to be ripped off at the market. Where do we start with that, Phil?
I still think Sunderland will get 2 in minimum. I think Dak's debut was like a sort of for me, a bit of an exhale. Like, good.
He's all right. Yeah,
He's good. He's experienced. He looks sharp. He's got real quality. You know, you could see Pritchard came to life the moment Dak was introduced. Someone he could bounce off, someone he could play little 1-2s with. That just that was like a bit of a deep breath moment. Like, oh yeah, I see that. That's going to work. That is definitely going to work if he can stay fit. But you know, he made 33 appearances last year, so we should give him some sort of respect, if you like, on that one. I know he's had 2 bad injuries, but he's a year down the line from that now.
And he was out of favour really with John Dawkins last season.
Yeah. So yeah, that was like, okay, cool, well done, like that. And now let's crack on. Listen, I'm sure they will sign another striker. Where I think everyone sort of goes, is it going to be an established striker where we go, oh yeah, or is it going to be someone quite exciting but quite raw? That's the question. I'm convinced Sunderland will sign another striker, not least because they know they need another one right now. But I think that the uncertainty over Ross Stewart demands that you get a permanent signing in now, so you're not in a situation come January where clubs can lowball you with Stewart bids, for example, knowing that you're kind of in a bit of a desperate situation. So, yeah, listen, the pressure's on. There's no doubt about it. We can all see absolutely. That's what's needed. You know, the departure of Lehaji made, I think, total sense. You know, I think everyone understood if there was a good offer on the table and you could free up some wages for a player who, while talented, clearly wasn't knocking the door down right now. It made sense to do it. And then, you know, in Speakman's comments, he said, didn't it, look, we're being pragmatic here. It creates immediate opportunities for us. And that lifts a certain level of pressure, and the club know that. So I think they've got to sign a striker, and I would suggest that they probably need to sign another wide forward, because if we're bluntly honest, while very talented, Burnett doesn't look quite there yet. No. Abdullah Bar's much harder to get your head around, because 3 or 4 times in the game he does something amazing, but he's nowhere near sort of Clark's level of consistency yet. So I think they need to. I still feel they'll get to. I expect it still to be tense and scary and angst-ridden.
I had in my head that Bar was more of a central player, but he's been deployed largely on the left during pre-season at the start of this season.
I think obviously he arrived as a central midfielder, but what we learned very quickly, especially after that Cardiff game when Neil and Bar played as a midfield too, and something just got totally overrun. What you saw then was Mowbray and the coaching staff made an almost immediate decision that he had to be played further forward, where he could take those risks on the ball, where he could dribble, where he could do all the things that he's good at without leaving the team overexposed. Now, where he's probably had his best football is playing as one of 2 number 10s, where he can do all that stuff, but he doesn't have a huge amount of responsibility, especially not off the ball. But of course, to play with 2 number 10s, you have to play with a back 3. And that isn't something that Sunderland particularly like doing, because they have 2 of the best wingers in the Championship. So I think the decision essentially is, where does Bar best fit in the way, the system that works best for the team? And I think the coaching staff's view is that probably off the left, where he can still dribble, where he can take defenders on, where he can drift in field at times. So I agree with you. He probably is more of a central player, but I think they find it very, very difficult to play him, certainly as one of 2 central midfielders. And obviously playing as the 10, which we see when Pritchard plays, has massive pressing responsibilities off the ball. So I think they feel that the left flank is probably the best place for him at the moment.
Just in terms of that pragmatism you mentioned earlier, Phil, there's a lot of talk about money and money being spent, and I think people can sometimes get a little carried away with some of the figures that are bandied around in the Championship. But for me, I've seen a lot of very, very level-headed friends and Sunderland fans say that we're not asking for Sunderland to blow a gasket in the transfer window and, have a splurge, for want of a better word. But you're looking at players like Ella Sims, who did go for a pretty penny, even Nathan Broadhead. Obviously, Sunderland were perhaps a little put off by his injury, but he did command a fairly decent fee to get him to Ipswich. Other players as well. There's a talk of a £1 million loan fee for Tom Cannon, which, you can argue all day whether that's worth it or not. A lot of Sunderland fans I'm talking to are saying, we don't want the club to overspend, but there's an acceptance that maybe at some point they're going to have to spend some money.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they haven't spent any money, because quite clearly they have. They've brought in players for fees, but those fees may need to increase, especially where it comes to a striker, because it is a premium position.
Yeah. So I'm going to say a couple of things here, and hopefully people will get to the end rather than just have a go, because the first bit will be more. The first thing to say is that Sunderland's net spend over the last 4 windows has been pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
It has been. It's just a fact. Now, I do think there is so, for example, the loan fee you mentioned, there is definitely a willingness from Sunderland to pay pretty hefty loan fees. Joe Gelhardt had most of the Championship wanting him. That was not cheap. That was not cheap. Sunderland, after Stewart got injured, were prepared to go and spend another massive loan fee. I think it's pretty well known that they had 4 strikers they were trying to sign on loan from the Premier League on January. Some of them would have come with big loan fees. One of the players they were looking at was Julian Enciso, who then went on and scored loads of goals for Brighton, but he didn't want to come down to the Championship. Fair play, worked out pretty well for him, let's be honest. But the point is that there is definitely a willingness to spend. What's also absolutely true is that the fundamental reason why Sunderland are finding it much harder to recruit strikers of a certain level than they are any other position in the pitch is because it costs more.
Yeah.
Simple as that. And that is absolutely true. And that is absolutely the case. And it is testing Sunderland's determination to stick to their budget and to pursue this really sustainable model. That is just a fact, because I agree Ella Sims is a really good player, but the numbers that we reached by the time Coventry signed him made it really difficult to see how you're going to get make that money back or exceed it in the future. Nathan Broadhead was exactly the same. Sunderland did agree a deal to sign him. Let's remember that they were going to sign Nathan Broadhead, but he decided to go elsewhere. And by the time January came round, Ipswich were offering huge numbers, that made it very difficult to see for a player of his age how he'd make a profit in the future. Now, fair play to Ipswich, he's got them promoted and he's helped them win their first game of the season. And I'm sure Sims will be excellent at Coventry. But the point is, Ipswich have owners who are willing to fund major losses in the near future, and Coventry had just banked 20 million for Gaio Corres. Sunderland are not willing to oversee huge losses. And it's a tricky one, because I get really frustrated. It is obvious that they need a striker, and it is obvious that they're going to have to push it. But I find it quite difficult after years of writing about how, Ella Shaw always just pushing things a little bit more, left the club in an utterly ruinous position. I mean, it was not viable as a football club.
Yeah.
And we also saw, what happened when Sunderland panicked and signed Will Grigg. The finances involved in that deal hamstrung them for the next 3-4 windows. And to be clear, I'm agreeing with the point, because it is the reason why they have not been able to agree a new contract with Ross Stewart. Because realistically, he would be able to get more money on the open market from the Championship clubs. It is the reason why I find it so hard to. It is finance. It is the fact that there's a pretty strict budget in place and there's a desire to be sustainable. And fundamentally, this is why at some point player sales are going to become important. And what Coventry have done this summer is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
So there's no easy answer. That's the sort of blunt response I've got to it.
It's
Because
interesting.
I totally get that, and I strongly think that they need to sort of have a deep think and recognise how important an accomplished striker is, and what it could do to this team, and what it could therefore do to the club. I totally get that argument. It makes total sense to me. As I say, I just find it really difficult to be strongly critical when we all know exactly the reason why there is this kind of strict thing in place with the budget, because of the potential consequences that we've seen, not just Sunderland, but so many other clubs experience as well.
It's interesting you mentioned the Coventry comparison there, because there's a lot said about the Brighton model, the Brentford model, Sunderland trying to emulate that, and there is something in that 100%. But in terms of where Sunderland are now, you're probably looking at what Coventry have done in the next sort of 6 months to 12 months as a sort of a little glimpse into the future of how Sunderland will potentially operate.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the other thing it says as well is that, you know, I mean, Crewe has funded losses. You know, I say there that they're not willing to write off huge losses. You know, Crewe has funded losses since he came into the club. The club is not yet at this point sustainable and profitable. So that's, you know, important to remember as well when we talk about
the commercial side out.
yeah, and it's a process, isn't it? And that's absolutely right. But I suppose the point I'm making is that we do need to be a little bit careful when we talk about ambition and spending, because it would be unfair to say that there's been neither. That just, in my eyes at least, that just wouldn't be accurate. But what we does feel like we are moving into a bit of a brick wall repeatedly with the striker situation, because they do cost more, and there is a reason why they cost more, because they win your matches. And how that resolves in the next few weeks is going to be genuinely fascinating. And like I say, I'm sorry that it's a cop out of an answer, but I'm not quite sure exactly where the balance lies between not being reckless, but also signing proven quality, which will help the team. I honestly don't know what the answer is. You know, it sounds like, you know, speaking to Mowbray the other night, he was sort of coming around to the view is, can we afford to wait for what we think is the perfect balance? And then potentially it falls through at the end of the window and we're panicking? Or do we just say, right, this player we really like, it's not quite perfect, but you know what, let's get it done and let's get it work. It sounds like he's sort of coming down on that side of it. And it'll be really interesting to see whether that means we see movements, you know, shortly. It's going to be really interesting to see how it resolves over the next few weeks, because I don't think this is sort of an easy answer.
No, I completely agree. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer on this this issue, but we've already gone 33 minutes, and we've got things to do, and everybody else has got things to do as well. So,
I am actually writing a piece about the striker issue we just spoke about, and I'm over 3/4 of the way through my word count, and I'm about 1/4 of the way through the piece. So I think that kind of
two parts, Phil. 2 parts.
I think that kind of sums it up, to be honest.
Well, excellent. We look forward to reading that, and you can find that over at the Sunderland Echo website, alongside all of the reaction from the Crewe game and the build-up to the Preston game. I think Joe Nicholson potentially will have a podcast with a Preston writer, we hope. But if not, catch us on match day over at the Sunderland Echo for all of the coverage from Deepdale. And thank you once again for listening.